Hello, everyone. My name is Gaëlle Morel, and I'm the curator exhibitions and collections at the Image Center here at Toronto Metropolitan University. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for a scholar talk with the great photography historian Nadya Bair for a lecture titled Photography Exhibitions and the Magnum Brand. Toronto Metropolitan University, where we are gathered, is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We embrace the responsibility we've inherited from generations that came before to care for this land and all the many people who visit or make their homes here. Nadya's talk is presented in conjunction with two of our exhibitions, which brings focus to the early history of picture agency Magnum Photos. In our main gallery, Magnum's First is Magnum Photos' first organized group exhibition called Face of Time, originally presented at the French Institute in Innsbruck, Austria in 1955. This historic show was thought lost for over 50 years before being rediscovered in 2006. It is now presented for the first time in North America. This exhibition was created as a platform to honor some of Magnum's most established founders while introducing younger, newly appointed members to a broader audience. As a bellwether of the agency's ambitious future, it led to an impressive expansion of Magnum's Photos' cultural and promotional activities. On view in our university gallery is Children of Europe by photojournalist and co-founder of Magnum Photos, David Chim Seymour. In 1948, Chim was commissioned by newly founded UNESCO to document the living conditions of children across a devastated and slowly recovering Europe. The resulting images formed Children of Europe, a landmark 1949 publication that raised international awareness of post-war displacement and humanitarian need. The author of the seminal book, The Decisive Network, Magnum Photos and the Post-War Image Market that we sell downstairs, published by University of California Press in 2020, Nadya will demonstrate how exhibitions and publications by Magnum members help consolidate the idea of the agency as a group of international humanist photographers who followed their instincts and values rather than catering to the work of its clients. By looking at the network of curators, publishers, and editors who were formative to the creation of Magnum's brand, her talk will consider the infrastructure for exhibiting photography at the mid-century. I want to take this opportunity to offer a great appreciation to Magnum Photos and also to Ben Schneiderman, Chim's nephew, who is present with us tonight. Thank you so much, Ben. Ben donated the photographs in the show downstairs to our collection and has stewarded Chim's legacy for many decades now. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a couple of housekeeping notes. We are recording tonight's program and we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel in the near future for those who aren't able to attend tonight in person or for those who want to watch it again. After the discussion, we will have a Q&A session and we will be taking questions from our audience. If you have a question, please wait until we bring you a microphone before speaking. This way we can make sure to capture your voice on our recording. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Nadya Bair, a historian of photography. You could come. A historian of photography, the press and mass visual culture. Nadya is assistant professor of art history at Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. Already mentioned her first monograph, The Decisive Network, Magnum Photos and the Post-War Image Market, won the 2021 Prose Award for Media and Cultural Studies. Her current book project on the International Center of Photography in New York and its founder, Cornel Kappa, was awarded the National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship for 2023-2024 and a fellowship at the Frankel Institute of Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan, where Bair is in residence right now until 2026. So we're very happy to welcome Nadya Bair to the Image Center and to Toronto. So now you can please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Am I on? Thank you so much, Gaëlle. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Gaëlle, so much for that introduction, for inviting me to talk here. I did the math and I gave my first talk at the Image Center a decade ago here when I was just starting my research. And so it's really wonderful to be back. The Image Center has been really formative to my work as a scholar. I've had the privilege of having a fellowship here. And it's just wonderful to be in this community where people are curating shows and doing photography research that is really pushing the field. And so I've learned a lot from everybody here. So I'm grateful to be back and share this with you. So just by a show of hands, how many of you have seen the exhibits downstairs? Okay, so most of you have. So I'm really going to be speaking for the most part to these exhibits. And if you haven't, then hopefully you will after. Okay. Oh, one sec. Oh, okay. No. Okay. So by its 5th anniversary in 1952, Magnum was still a young organization, and its future was far from secure. Addressing his photographer colleagues as Magnum's president, Robert Capa was blunt. He wrote, "The biggest sickness of Magnum photographers is that their journalistic quality is nearly nil. They shoot pictures instead of stories." He advised photographers to think much more seriously about narrative and to envision how their pictures would get laid out in magazines. Looking at the European situation, where paper rationing was still in effect, but new magazines were being founded, editors were really hungry for new content, he said a good news story, if we produce it, could be sold in Europe to 9 separate publications, as is. In that same report, he told photographers not to look down on public relations assignments, and without skipping a beat in the next paragraph, to think about Magnum's own publicity. "Let's make books, organize exhibits, enter and win contests, and establish our reputation beyond any question," he implored. So in one document, we see Magnum's sales strategy flowing seamlessly into a discussion about photo exhibits and the need for better self-promotion. And these ideas are really key to understanding both of the exhibits that are currently on view. So my talk tonight is going to have 3 parts. I'll begin with a brief intro into Magnum, or my take on Magnum, my research on Magnum, and then I'm really going to turn to Magnum's exhibitions, looking first at The Face of Time, and then in some greater detail, Schim's Children of Europe, a project made in '48, but that became the subject of an exhibit in 1957, as I'll tell you. Throughout, I'm going to consider what these exhibits tell us about Magnum's relationship to their clients in the 40s and 50s, and how these exhibits can help us understand how Magnum actively built up its brand. So still in existence today, Magnum is an international photo agency founded in 1947 by 5 established photographers and 2 female staff who got their start in the interwar period. Today, Magnum is probably the best-known photo agency in history, but it was certainly not the first organization of its kind. Photo agencies were and still are crucial fixtures in the market for commercial photography. They represent independent photographers in the way galleries represent and sell the work of artists. Because of the invention of new camera, there's going to be a lot of text, watch out. Because of the invention of new camera technologies and printing techniques in blue that allowed for images to appear alongside text, photo agencies really proliferated at the turn of the century, as you can see here with this timeline. And these agencies supplied a growing number of newspapers, magazines, advertisers, and book publishers with photographs. Most pictures seen by the public first pass through the hands of agency editors and salespeople. Photo agencies give us this macro perspective into how photographs were made and how they circulate, and this is the value of studying them. Now, in 1947, Magnum gave each of its 5 founding photographers a region of the world to cover. This was what any magazine or news bureau did at the time. In these locations, photographers were responsible for producing photo essays about events in their part of the world. To sell their pictures, Magnum opened 2 offices, one in New York to deal with American clients, and one in Paris to deal with European clients. The staff was the crucial bridge between photographers out in the field and the editorial offices. They were the ones who negotiated prices, communicated what editors wanted. They gave photographers technical feedback on their film, which they could not see while they were working most of the time. They sent them back to be developed, and then were told, like, actually, you forgot to take your lens cover off, or load your camera or whatever, right? And then edited and captioned their pictures. Now, Magnum was not the only photo agency to open in the 20th century, but it did inaugurate 2 business policies that distinguished it from others. First, photographers were the shareholders of the organization rather than its employees. And this means they took charge of Magnum's editorial direction and its finances. Second, Magnum's photographers, not their clients, owned the negatives and copyrights after any work was made. This was a new and excellent business strategy because it essentially gave them the chance to maximize their profits. Every time they made pictures, they could sell them as many times as possible. No client owned their work. But this policy, the second one in particular, actually both of them together, created the idea that their photography was their intellectual property as well, meaning that it was conceived of by photographers independently, rather than shot for clients with a good idea, which is what it was a lot of the time. Now, in just 10 years, Magnum became the best-known photo agency. Most went out of business, but Magnum still exists. It's weathered the storm of the changing media landscape, of the rise of television and news in the 60s and 70s, which put a lot of photographers out of work. They've survived the sale and merger of picture libraries that happened in the 90s by giants like Getty Images. And the reason for its survival has a lot to do with its brand, perpetuated through blockbuster exhibitions and catalogs produced by Magnum itself. Today, Magnum is known according to a lot of the same iconic photographs and very particular narratives. This is what Roland Barthes called mythologies, ways of telling history in a way that naturalizes it, makes it seem self-evident rather than cultural or historical. The 2 main narratives by which Magnum is often discussed is the idea of the decisive moment, the photographer seeking out decisive moments. And a lot of photographers working in Magnum identify with Henri Cartier-Bresson as the creator of that idea. And then there's the photographers who work in the spirit of Robert Capa and concerned photography. So often they're in one of these 2 camps. And they're celebrated for these brave and elite photojournalists who Magnum often tells us cared more about taking great pictures than they did about making money. So when I started working on Magnum, I had a couple of really basic questions. What were the unique demands of photojournalism that they were navigating in 1947, right after the war was over? Things changed, but what did they do to change, to kind of be in conversation and take advantage of that new market? And if Magnum is so important, which I thought it was, why do we know so little about it beyond those 2 narratives, those self-produced narratives? So to answer those questions, I traveled to public archives, foundations, photographer estates. I contacted people who had worked at Magnum, were married to Magnum photographers, had materials in their basements, their attics. And when I started, I was told I wasn't going to get anywhere because photographers didn't keep records, right? Like the martini lunch myth. And then, right, they just kind of decided everything in person and then they just did it, right? There were no records. And then the second was that everything had already been written. What can you say that's new? But I discovered a lot of pages, thousands of pages that attested to a very different history of the agency and the practice of photography. So my book, which Gael plugged, thank you, traces the Magnum from its inception in 1947 to the closure of illustrated magazines and a growing art market for photography in the 60s. And my title, if you hadn't noticed already, is a play on Cartier-Bresson's theory of the decisive moment, which he defined as a perfectly balanced scene captured by an intuitive and attentive photographer who clicked the shutter just in time. Now, this idea really puts all the attention on the photographer, often in his moment of inspiration. But I believe that to understand Magnum, we have to look beyond just individual photographers and really look at what I call this decisive network. Magnum worked with many different markets and collaborated with vast numbers of people who were rethinking the scale and purpose of news photography in the post-war world. Right after World War II, Magnum worked with Ladies' Home Journal and UNESCO to produce surveys of post-war life. Simultaneously, photographers competed with Life magazine staffers to get their international news reporting into the magazine. They were also making newsy travel photography for the glamorous Holiday magazine, which was really interested in color, as you can see, and gave photographers a really large budget and film supplies and other supplies, allowing them to actually hone their skills in color photography, which was new to many of them. And they took on corporate publicity and advertising already in the late 40s and 50s for a host of clients like Standard Oil, IBM, Bank of New York, and others. And this work often allowed them to get to hard-to-reach locations where they could then scout out stories that they would publish in Life or in Holiday magazine. Across these settings, Magnum's publicity work exploited the human interest angle and this spontaneous, action-packed look of journalism. So corporations wanted the same thing they were doing for the press. And I found that a lot of what later became reframed as humanism actually started as human interest journalism that was being done for a lot of these clients. And they wanted Magnum photographers because they did it well and they could adapt to different markets. Now, importantly, as you've already seen, this decisive network included many women, not just capable picture editors and sales agents, but also photographers' wives, partners, siblings, cousins, who helped their husbands by captioning, researching their stories, maintaining their picture archives. This was indispensable labor for which they were never credited, sometimes not even paid. And today, I'm going to be talking about a number of these women who are far less known than its photographers, but who are really crucial to Magnum's brand and business. So let's go back to 1952. When, in order to expand its markets and build up its reputation, Magnum began talking about exhibitions. Not just let's send a photograph or a few photographs to Edward Steichen at MoMA who's doing a show, but actually let's organize our own exhibition. Edward Steichen was the curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, right? So there were other exhibits being done at the time, but really when they started curating their own exhibits. So the Face of Time was the first exhibit Magnum organized in-house. Most likely, it was put together in its Paris office. From there, it traveled to 5 cities across Austria between June of 1955 and February of 1956. And like most photo shows at the time, it was a modular show that was made to tour. So if you look at the history of photography exhibitions, they look like this at this time, okay? So from the 40s, even you can go back to the 20s, MoMA, Life magazine, the George Eastman Museum, Smithsonian, they all had traveling exhibition departments. And this is how they toured photographs. You got the instructions on how you should mount them, and then they were put up on whatever supports you had. They were tacked, they were pasted, there were no frames. This is a UNESCO, United Nations Human Rights exhibition from 1948. This is a preview of an exhibit that Cornel Kappa did right before he created the International Center for Photography in 1974. So there were these modular things. For instance, and they were often put onto color fiber boards. If anyone noticed, one of the weird things about the show downstairs is the color. That's right? Why is that? So this was actually a technique that institutions used. Memorable Life photographs, which premiered at MoMA in 1951, then traveled through Europe. And when it traveled, it was actually pasted onto red fiberboards because red was associated with the Life logo. And so they wanted to use that color to kind of anchor the exhibit. So that's part of the reason. So it wasn't so unique at that time to use these color panels. So when we look at the exhibit, there was a single prologue that introduced the 8 photographers. Each of them were represented by one assignment on those color panels. And three of these photographers were Jewish photographers born in Austria, so they were Austrian born. So this was important kind of as a kind of PR move for sending your exhibit through Austria. Now, you might have also noticed that the exhibit doesn't exactly preserve what we might think of as Magnum's important photographs. Rather, what it does is it preserves the preoccupations of Magnum in 1955. So let's consider perhaps the most bizarre contribution, which is Ernst Haas, a photographer who, as the wall text tells us, is actually known for his color photography. So here's an example of the color photography that appeared in Life magazine that is described in the wall text. And these photo essays offered readers a highly subjective, even poetic impression of New York City. But then in the face of time, he's represented by 13 black and white pictures that are made on the set of Howard Hawks' film, The Land of the Pharaohs. And we're not looking in these pictures of life in Egypt in 1954, what you would expect to do with photojournalistic work. These are publicity shots of film extras who are working on a set. So what's going on, right? So film publicity was actually Magnum's first foray into public relations photography. The market took off around 1950 as post-war film productions moved out of Hollywood and onto locations around the world. American and European directors, people like Anatoly Litvak, John Huston, they had actually met some of the Magnum founders in World War II. They knew Robert Capa, they knew David Seymour from the war. Now, after the war, they called up their old friends and they said, we're making this film in whatever country, can you come and document it because I think you're already somewhere around there. So that's how this story came about. Here's another example. Here's Robert Capa working on the set of Beat the Devil. And they wanted Magnum on sets because they weren't paparazzi photographers. They were photojournalists who were able to turn kind of cinematic illusion back into stories about real people and real places. And when these pictures appeared in the press, they were sold as photojournalism, not as studio handouts. These were stories that could be editorial features that drummed up excitement about an upcoming movie, about the locations, about the celebrities involved. And Howard Hawks actually wanted Robert Capa. Robert Capa was really involved in pushing this market. He wanted Capa on the set of Land of the Pharaohs, but Capa was too busy. So he sent his young protege, Ernst Haas, who was really not known at that time. But Haas had the time, and so he made the pictures. Now, these photographs. Now, Capa's portfolio is also atypical because it's from a recent assignment in the Basque region of Spain, which was assigned to him by Holiday magazine. Now, Capa was working for Holiday magazine a lot at this time. He was doing color photography. He was doing Willem de Arets. He was doing kind of vacation shoots, very glamorous, kind of jet set photography. Holiday and Magnum was working really hard to cultivate. Holiday, it paid better than Life magazine. It got them to these faraway locations. Holiday was also the magazine that commissioned this portfolio from Inga Morath. They wanted to do a story on high fashion in London society, and that's why we have these pictures from that time. Now, the photographer with the longest and probably most familiar edit for us is Henri Cartier-Bresson. His photographs from India of Gandhi's last days and funeral had appeared in Life magazine, and then they had also been selected and arranged for the 1952 photo book, The Decisive Moment. They were also printed and ready for his solo traveling exhibit that was designed by the French curator Robert Delpierre to accompany that book. So a very different relationship to those pictures. So if you feel like the exhibit looks uneven, there are reasons for this. In the mid-1950s, exhibits were new to Magnum. The Face of Time was not meant to succeed as an exhibit or show the timeless nature of Magnum's photography, never mind its status as art. It was meant to drum up business in Europe. And here's what the mounting instructions actually said. The panels in a series must be hung one over the other with edges flush. Otherwise, the impression of a reportage, of a continuing report, will not be strong enough. And this is very important for the exhibition. So made up of recent reportage, the show was even meant to read like a photo essay in the illustrated press. It's also important that this show was curated very soon after the death of Robert Capa, who stepped on a landmine in Indochina in the spring of 1954. This was a huge loss for Magnum. Key staff in the Paris office quit. New ones had just come on board. If you've ever started a new job, it's like it takes you a while to figure out what's in the files. They didn't know what was really in the files. They needed to show clients that Magnum still had a lot of new talent. So that's why the show featured work by these newer and as yet unknown photographers, Marc Ribot, Eric Lessing, Jean Marquis, who actually left within a year. Jean Marquis was married to Susie Marquis, who was Robert Capa's cousin, who was working in the Magnum Paris office. She quit after Robert Capa died. Okay, so this is inside politics here. So, but they were showing, look, we have these young photographers. They're ready for new assignments. They're ready to work with editors. And particularly editors in Europe, which Magnum was working much harder to cultivate at this time than American markets, where it was doing better. And this exhibit is also why, when you look at Magnum's early exhibits, all of its shows were actually touring Europe. They weren't touring the United States. The United States, Magnum was kind of already known, but in 1956, Magnum did a Photokina exhibit, which for a long time was thought of as the first Magnum exhibit until this discovery. But Photokina was an international expo. Photography critics went there. They wrote about it. There was press. The Face of Time was much quieter. It was made specifically for Austrian audiences, and then it was simply forgotten after it was packed up, after its final viewing. Now, the fact that an exhibit could sit in crates for decades shows that Magnum was very busy at the time with new projects. Organizing exhibits was a haphazard and chaotic process, not only in Europe, but also in the US. Writing from the New York office in March of 1956, staff member Inga Bondi, who was soon promoted to be editor of exhibitions, special projects, and advertising, she told photographers, people are approaching us more and more about exhibitions, museums, colleges, cultural societies. This is because more and more photography exhibitions are being circulated in the US. But too often, when we have projects, there's a mad scurry through the files for pictures. So send us a selection of pictures by which you want to be known. Magnum photographers who lived into old age and who were with the agency for a really long time, Cartier-Bresson, George Roger, and others, Ernst Haas, they had time to select the pictures by which they wanted to be known. And those are the pictures that we often see in Magnum exhibits today, including those Cartier-Bresson pictures from India. But for the two Magnum founders who died unexpectedly, Robert Capa in 1954 and then David Seymour in 1956, their picture selection happened posthumously. Family members and colleagues decided which pictures were representative of their careers and what those pictures meant. And so that brings us to Shim's Children of Europe, which became by far his best known project, also with the help of exhibits. But before we delve more deeply into that legacy, let's first step back to better understand Shim's post-war career and how these pictures were made in the first place. All good? Are we with me? Okay. We're doing good? Okay, great. Okay, so the Jewish-Polish-born David Seymour became established as a photojournalist in interwar Paris. Like many Polish Jews, he left Poland in the 1930s, eventually made his way to Paris. He befriended there, among others, the Hungarian Jewish emigre Robert Capa. Together, they covered the Spanish Civil War. They eventually both settled in the US, that kind of double exile of Central and Eastern European photographers on the eve of World War II. They kind of lived that out as well. In addition, Shim, and I'll be going back and forth between saying Shim and Seymour, Shim's sister Eileen and her husband, the Yiddish journalist Shmuel Leib Schneiderman, also had immigrated to Paris and moved to New York City around just on the eve of the war. And Shim became an American citizen in 1942. And he served as a photo interpreter for the US Air Force. And throughout the war, he and Eileen exchanged letters, worrying about their parents and their aunts who had stayed behind in Poland. When the war ended, they learned that many of their parents and other relatives had been killed in the Holocaust. When he returned to New York, the recent tragedies were weighing heavily on his mind. And his first journalistic break came after the war, before Magnum's founding, when he was assigned to travel to England, France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany with a team of journalists to survey post-war life for This Week. So This Week was a Sunday magazine supplement syndicated to major newspapers across the US. And this was a 22-page photo essay called We Went Back, consisting of short reports on the state of bread, shelter, the Americans, politics, morals, children. And so in the report on shelter and children, which Shim contributed, we see This Week's editor printing some of the pictures in large format to heighten their emotional impact. Here we see a German miner's daughter who stares intently at the camera while filling up on soup distributed by the Red Cross. And so she symbolizes the toll of war on children while promoting the work of humanitarian organizations. Children were filling the news in these years, their stories and pictures mobilized by magazine and newspaper editors in order to build support for reconstruction and rehabilitation in Europe. Shim's story was part of a larger movement to present children as the symbolic heart of post-war relief efforts. And Shim, after he finished this, he was getting ready to go back to New York when he got this cable. Your vice president of Magnum Photos, detailed letter sent to Paris, May 22nd, will shortly have interesting assignments for you. Disadvise your return. Await me in Paris. So he finds out he's vice president of Magnum Photos. And so he was assigned to Europe for the new organization. Now, in order to maximize business, photographers needed to generate story ideas from their part of the world, and they needed to help secure clients. For that, they needed to know what magazines were interested in. And staff helped them figure this out. In one of her first letters, Rita Vandevert, who worked in the New York office, said to Shim, lots of magazines seem to be thinking in terms of a 2-page spread on any simple but lively subject, preferably something where the idea is already familiar to American readers, but the setting strange and interesting. Stories showing how people live, their family life, their work, their recreation, their hobbies, etc. So she scoffed at American editors for their kind of predictable tastes on behalf of readers, but she hoped that Seymour would apply that template to Europe. But Shim faced two major challenges. The first was that he didn't actually yet have the established relationships with American editors who paid more, that Roger, that Kappa, that Cartier-Bresson did. Now, in the late 1930s, Shim had worked for many leftist publications that had since folded in Europe, Vous, Regard, Ce Soir. He covered Popular Front politics. He covered the Spanish Civil War. But when he was in the Air Force during World War II, that actually took him away from reporting. Kappa, George Roger, they worked for Life. They made splashy news in Life magazine. What Shim did was actually 80% of the photography of World War II, which was the invisible labor, it was the photo intelligence work. The editorial work that we associate with World War II was actually 10 to 20% of all the photos that came out. So he was kind of working behind the scenes here, doing very important work. But when the war was over, he needed to take more financial risks. He needed to maybe produce stories on his own time. Maybe he needed to accept shorter assignments that weren't that interesting, but that would make him known to American editors so that he could get bigger assignments. But he was kind of slow to take initiative, in part for reeling from the experiences of World War II still. He often asked Magnum staff to give him advice, and often asked for more advice than they had time to give. Second, he was interested, Shim, already in 1947, was really interested in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust. And this, from a market perspective, was also problematic. Now, Robert Capa had shot a few stories for Life on those topics in 1945. He photographed the first Rosh Hashanah service in Berlin, these illegitimate children of Nazi officers. But these, as you can see, they were lighthearted stories, they were brief, and they were in print in 1945, when the war was still really fresh on people's minds. Seymour wanted to keep tackling the story 2 years later, And he recognized, like historians do now, that the world didn't simply return to normal in 1945. But his preoccupation with the war's aftermath actually made him resistant to Magnum's sales plan momentarily. He proposed a trip to his native Poland to document the transfer of Polish refugees. And you know what Rita Vandervert said? She said, Life will publish it only if it's sufficiently bad. They're not going to publish it unless there are starving hordes and corpses everywhere. They don't want a more nuanced story about this. So he slowly realized that American magazines were not particularly interested in seeing the human tolls of war. And when his first break came as a Magnum photographer, it was not for a magazine, it was for an international organization, which was UNESCO. So founded in 1945, the Charter of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization had identified cultural ignorance as the root cause of war. And its preamble began, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And to counteract that ignorance, UNESCO relied extensively on print media before it launched into radio and television in the 50s and beyond. Now, in September of 1947, Shim was at the International Congress of Modern Architects in Bridgewater, England. He hoped to make a story for Fortune. That didn't work out, but he met UNESCO staff at this conference who were working directly for UNESCO's Director General, Julian Huxley, and he pitched them this reconstruction story. Shim, maybe like many, didn't actually fully know who Huxley was, what UNESCO was up to. He wrote to Magnum and he called their staff crazy, excited, strange people. And he told Rita Vandervert and Maria Eisner basically to decide whether a trip over there, over Europe, under the auspices of UNESCO is worthwhile. I leave this entirely up to both of you girls. And so the girls ruled in UNESCO's favor, and Shim finally got his large-scale project to take him through Eastern Europe. Now, the photographs, which are reproduced and shown in different ways in the exhibit downstairs, really giving you, I think, a very rich sense of the context in which they appeared and how they circulated. The photographs of orphaned and abandoned children that Seymour made between March and June 1948 in Poland, Hungary, Austria, Italy, and Greece first appeared in the standalone book published by UNESCO called The Children of Europe, which he worked very hard to produce. If I understand correctly, he laid out the pictures himself. He also wrote the text. And he wrote the text from the perspective of an anonymous child who had survived the war and who was now informing adults who just wanted to move on with life about the costs of the war on children. So he filled the text with statistics. You know, there's 1.7 million orphans in Poland, 100,000 in Warsaw alone. And he described the nature of children's ailments, physical and emotional suffering in a lot of detail. And his letter was really accusatory, and so were the captions, many of which addressed readers directly in French, English, and in Spanish, because it was, as an international organization, it was going to be circulated to multiple audiences. Now, after creating this kind of image of dire need, the report then turned to what kind of help UN agencies were providing. In one picture, the one you see all the way on the right, two children are looking intently at the photographer, their gaze just higher than the camera. The picture kind of resembles that photograph we saw earlier from this week in Germany, but the petitionary quality here is heightened by these empty cups the children are tilting towards the camera. There weren't any explicit fundraising kind of messages in this publication, but the pictures also appeared in the UNESCO Courier, a UN publication that targeted the English-speaking public, alongside instructions on how to help Europe's children. Now, because Magnum kept its redistribution rights, it was able to sell these pictures really widely. And this was the first big story by Shim that Magnum distributed across the European market. It sold the pictures to Life, but also Illustrated in London, Cieux & Air, France Illustration, really widely. And the pictures, when they appeared in magazine form, so here I'm showing you Life, were much more about Shim's journey through Europe and the quality of the pictures he was able to take than they were about the fate of the war survivors. Life magazine, remember, they didn't want the story from Poland in 1947, but now that the project was completed, they did devote 7 pages to the children of Europe in its December 1948 issue. And they reproduced, as you can see here, some of the photographs in very large scale with minimal captions, really focusing readers' attention on the heartbreaking evidence of the war. And Life was actually the first in the US to print this photograph of Tereska drawing her home on a blackboard, initiating that picture's journey to its current iconic status. This startling portrait of a child's tumultuous mental state was actually excluded from the Children of Europe, probably because it didn't clearly show how the UN was helping children in need. Perhaps it needed the meaning relied too much on the caption. Life editors agreed that some of Seymour's images, quote, dramatize the important task of aiding the slow progress from sickness to health. And then the story then ended, as you can see kind of up there, with an appeal of like, these are the organizations you can give money to. And in this way, the story recognized that the pictures are news, but that they're also advocacy. So Life had finally given Shim his break. And it had begun as public relations and as fundraising photography. He made those pictures not simply because he was empathetic, but also because UNESCO needed him as a photojournalist who could apply the reportorial and visual strategies of print media to raise money for and build awareness about UNESCO. So they needed each other. In the 1940s, Children of Europe was one answer to what a not yet super well-known freelance photojournalist committed to documenting the aftermath of war could do in this political and media climate in which the war was no longer news. Now, following the picture's wide distribution, Shim's career really took off. More assignments came his way. He adapted to the needs of the tastes of his clients. He worked in color. Editors were very happy to publish stories. He did a lot on religion, on politics in Italy, Greece, and he did celebrity photographs. He also began to work on film sets. This is one of my favorite photographs where he's on the set of Funny Face. This is Richard Avedon and Fred Astaire, who's playing Richard Avedon. It's very meta. That was published in Harper's Bazaar. So he did all the different kind of photography after that. Now, the UNESCO story was a success, but the idea that it was exceptional for its moment or that it should have an afterlife gained momentum only after Shim's unexpected death covering the Suez War in 1956. That year, photography curator Peter Pollack was planning a broad retrospective of Shim's work at the Art Institute of Chicago. And that was supposed to include his color photography, his travel work, his celebrity photographs. But Shim's untimely death led him to change course and make a curatorial eulogy that was far more limited in scope. Pollack didn't deny his intervention. He said, it was to have been an exhibition of the photographs and places I picked with him in Rome last summer, but now consists entirely of pictures he took of children, tattered, nameless, bewildered children. Shim made most of the images after the war, though pictures from the Spanish Civil War, some from Israel that he photographed in the 1950s, also kind of helped round out this thematic arc. And the public received Shim's children enthusiastically. After Chicago, the exhibit traveled again to museums, university galleries in the US and Europe. The project also became the centerpiece of the first monographs on the photographer. This one in 1966, which was kind of a very small scale in terms of size publication. And then in 1974, the monograph, both of which were produced by the Robert Capa David Seymour Photographic Foundation. You'll recall that Capa and Shim died 2 years apart from each other. Neither had children, but they left behind 2 devoted siblings, Eileen Schneiderman and Cornell Capa. Eileen was actually the one who took the first step to commemoration when she and her husband created a photographic foundation in memory of her brother in 1958. Cornell soon joined her, as did Rosalina Bischoff, who was the widow of Magnum photographer Werner Bischoff, pictured on the left here, who had also died on assignment in 1954. these relatives and siblings brought on a staff member to go back into Magnum's files and to organize a collection of approximately 100 master prints. I'm pretty sure those Basque photographs by Capa were not in that selection of 100 master prints, right? They're not known. And in fact, today, when you see a Robert Capa photograph, they are most likely one of 937 that Cornell Capa then recurated. And so there's three master sets, and those are usually the pictures that are shown in the exhibits. Okay, it's kind of wild. Okay, and so they began to define these master sets, and then they began to look for places to exhibit and show the work. This foundation went through multiple iterations, as you see here. Cornell Capa really became its public face, and the work moved from commemorating the deceased to something much bigger, to creating an institution supporting concerned photography. This immensely influential concerned photographer exhibition of 1967 singled out Shim's UNESCO pictures as an exemplary accomplishment in the history of photography. And you see two of his pictures from the UNESCO assignment all the way on that far right edge, and across is Capa's falling soldier, which Cornell Capa really kind of lifted up as an icon of Robert Capa's work. Cornell claimed that Shim had shown how the camera could reveal the human condition. These ideas about Shim's empathy and the humanism of his pictures continued to circulate with every new installation of the concerned photographer, which toured the US. I mean, it really toured the world, Europe, Asia, into the 1970s. Those pictures were also important for another show that Cornell Capa curated in 1966 to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of Shim's death, which was called Shim's Times. And that exhibit also toured, arranged by Inga Bondi at the Magnum office, and it traveled internationally. So Shim's pictures of Europe's children became central both to his individual legacy and to the institution Cornell finally created in 1974 when he opened the International Center of Photography as New York's first museum, archive, and educational forum devoted exclusively to documentary photography. And that is Cornell Capa in People magazine in 1977. So becoming really like this kind of public persona and celebrity in his own right. Now, in the beginning, ICP's archive consisted primarily of concerned photographers that it was exhibiting. Cornell's brother, Robert, Shim, whose photographs Eileen Schneiderman began donating to ICP annually. When ICP needed to raise funds to support its archives in 1981, it used the tools of the art market for photography and created its first limited edition portfolio of 12 Shim prints, including Tereska, reprints of Shim's work, including a retrospective, which was also shown at ICP in 1981 to coincide with the limited edition portfolio and to inaugurate a permanent collection space. These projects all consistently described his work as deeply moving and relied on his post-war work as the centerpiece. By contrast, Robert Capa's reputation, which was also being forged in these years, was much more about his heroic feats in war, about being close to the action, promoted through, death of a loyalist, of a Republican soldier, and from Spain and World War II. So I don't wish in any way to suggest that this interpretation of Shim was wrong, but I do want to underscore that it was a posthumous interpretation of a complex career and a life, which so often happens in commemorative and biographical work and not just in photography. In a completely different context, Henry James wrote that after a death, a person is, quote, strangely simplified and summarized. Accidents have dropped away from it. Shades have ceased to count. And the person's work stands sharply for a few estimated and cherished things, rather than nebulously for a swarm of possibilities. The meaning of Shim's work became foundational, not just to his memory, but to Magnum's self-described humanist mission, propagated in many catalogs, exhibits that it created in subsequent decades, Today, Magnum is turning to other strategies. It's mining its archive. It's telling us you never knew about the color work. You never seen the contact sheets, kind of that materiality of photography. And it's monetizing it. But of course, if you knew about Holiday magazine, you would know that everybody knew the Magnum's holiday work already at the time, right? So there are new strategies being invented now. And one of the other things that Magnum does now to kind of create interest in itself is to restage historic shows, which it did downstairs, including showing us, the materiality of those crates that they were packaged in. Now, the success of Shim's Children of Europe fits well with Magnum's reputation of empathy and humanism, but The Face of Time makes less sense to us today. But both shows open onto this specific moment in the image market when the name Magnum had little of the meaning it carries now, and when there were still a swarm of possibilities. Thank you. I will be very happy to take your questions if we have time. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadya. Can you hear? I did. Oh, you did. Gotcha. Thanks so much, Nadya. It was wonderful. Is there any immediate questions, sir? Carol, can you? Thank you.
Hi. Hello. I was just wondering, was there any pushback when the idea of the photographers maintaining copyright when that came out?
Yes, especially at Life. And so one of the things that Life tried to do was to arrange these exclusive contracts where the pictures would stay out of circulation for, let's say, 30 to 60 days. But after that, they were no longer interesting as news. And so then they couldn't really resell them. So that was a big problem. So Life was the magazine that they had to fight the most with in order to, when they sold the pictures, to not lose the right to republish them elsewhere. So then they came up with many different tiers of contracts, like exclusive in the US. We won't sell them to Holiday, but we'll sell them in Europe at the same time. So yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I saw this show in 2012 in Ljubljana and was amazed to see it here.
This one, oh yeah.
Yeah, but that's not my question. Who now?
Makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Right.
Who now does what Life magazine and Holiday used to do? Is there still a print business out there, publication?
I mean, that's a great question. I won't despair over the state of our world today, but I will say something that I actually, Susan Meiselas, the Magnum photojournalist who was here about a decade ago when they first did their show at the Ransom Center, she made this really important point, which is like, yeah, there are different places to publish photographs now, but there are certain professionals who no longer exist, and the photo editor that's really a profession that no longer exists. These photographers were relying on other people to curate their work in a sense, right? And now, what does Getty Images do? It just dumps everything that a photographer photographed that day, right? So it's not just about the publications themselves, but it's about that selection process, which is so important for filtering out all the, the bad outtakes, right? So yeah, but Holiday was one of the first really like the lifestyle magazines that we have, Travel, Sunset, it was really the first of that genre of magazine where it was about where you go, but also the lifestyle you lead.
Thank you, Nadya. That was amazing. My question is about how Magnum understood at that time its own brand identity as being the agency of superstar photographers. And by the way, I don't know if they really did in the 1950s see themselves that way. But that's certainly, if that was their goal, they succeeded in it. Even today, they're seen as the best of the best. Were there other agencies at that time who promoted them their brand
Mhm.
as a brand, so that you would have, I mean, I'm not aware of any other agency that would do, say, a show about the agency
Mhm.
with different photographers, as if to suggest, hire us,
Mhm.
hire this agency because we have Babe Ruth,
Mhm.
Greg,
Mhm.
all the best.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious about that. Were they aware of that at that time? Is that sort of how they promoted themselves? Were they really self-conscious of doing it that way? And are they unique among other
Yeah.
agencies in that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I also am not aware of similar shows. Jonathan Dentler is here. Maybe he knows he works on photo agencies as well, a fellow this year at the Image Center. So maybe he knows of other agencies doing shows. I don't know of other ones like it, but I'll let you answer in 1 second. I just want to say one thing, which is that no, it wasn't primarily about the superstar photographers in the beginning. One of the things, and I mentioned Robert Capa's death, and I've come to appreciate this more actually after I finished the project, of what a big shock that was to the photographic community and how much Magnum had to work to show future clients that it could still get its act together. So a lot of what it did was, and I've seen a lot of promotional materials where, yeah, these are the photographers, but like we have Inga Bondi, and Inga Bondi really knows how to work with Harper's Bazaar and Vogue. And so they were also really selling themselves as an efficient organization. Because actually Magnum had a terrible reputation for as people to work with. Like they lost things, they didn't answer letters, they could sometimes, miss deadlines. And so there were hiccups that they needed to correct in that early period. And I think there was that process of consolidation over decades about the superstar photojournalists that happened in light of those things. But when you look at the 50s stuff, it's really about us as an organization and not only the photographers. What do you think? Are there other photo agencies that did shows at the time?
I don't know. I don't know about agencies so much, but I wouldn't be surprised. I know a little bit more about wire services,
Yeah.
but I know that I think it wasn't as organized as what Magnum did, but I know that picture editors at the AP would put in work to make sure that their photographers were represented in traveling exhibitions like through MoMA and stuff like that. So
Yeah, and sometimes it's a matter of like staff resources, right? Magnum eventually hired a director of exhibitions, and they didn't have as many photographers. I mean, AP had a lot. It was anybody, Black Star, anyone could really sell through Black Star, but Magnum, it was a more curated collection, right? Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting question. Maybe Magnum. I wanted to ask a question. This is kind of big picture.
Yeah.
But what you said just about how human interest becomes
Yeah.
humanism,
Yeah.
I thought was such an interesting point, and I
Yeah.
wondered if you would expand on that. Are these just two sides of the same coin, or is it human interest when it's in a newspaper or a magazine, and then becomes humanism when it's in an archive or a photo book?
I mean, in some ways, yes, I think that's what it is. I think that humanism is a more qualitative and value-laden almost judgment that is meant to kind of elevate the value of those pictures. But I was really interested in understanding why did those pictures get made in the first place. And I did a lot of reading, like you did, about like what did journalism look like. And human interest journalism was really important to the development of journalism. And so I realized, and then they started talking about it in their letters, like, we need a human interest story. And I was like, oh, that's why they got the pictures of all the people. And yes, some of them were good. And then it was Peter Hamilton's essay in Peter Hamilton, who contributed to that Stewart Hall book on cultural representation in 1981, that had a long essay about humanism in photography. And I think it was this cultural studies turn in the 80s when we really started studying photographs and photojournalism, and Hall was really important to that. But that essay really canonized the idea of humanism. And that is the lens through which it read all of the stuff. And Peter Hamilton was like, humanism is in the press, black and white, by French photographers. Like, it was the whole cultural studies criteria of what humanism is. But yeah.
Wasn't making the argument there in that though about the connection with the human.
He wasn't. That's right. Right. He wasn't. But yeah.
Thank you for what was a remarkable talk. I just fully consumed by it. I mean, the stories you tell about my uncle, David Seymour, just register very deeply with me. And these other people, Inga Bondi, Cornell Kappa, who were real people to me.
Yeah.
And as a high school student, I worked for Cornell and organizing Robert Kappa's materials. So it's just wonderful, and I have a lot more to say. The question I'd like to ask is, reflecting on the issues here of the way the world has changed. In those days, these guys, and it was mostly the guys, believed that a single picture could change the world, and sometimes they succeeded. I don't know that that's true anymore. Could you comment on the way that photography has lost its evidentiary capability in the age of AI and synthetic imagery?
Do you really need me to comment on that?
Yes.
I mean,
it's a different. In the sense that photography is different now. The magazines are gone, but the web is there.
So I work on the past for a reason. I am more comfortable in the past. But what I will say is, and when I teach like the history of photography, we get all the way up to the present. And one of the things that I try to show is, I emphasize, what is a rupture? What is a continuity in the history of photography? And these crises about where the picture is going to appear, or are the pictures really real, they were present with photography's invention. So in some ways, yes, everything is new, but in some ways, everything is old. The
distribution mechanisms are very different.
Yeah,
how would you describe how things are now?
I think they're stuck on the Getty Images website. It's like a backlog, right? It's like, right? And it's also constant, right? I mean, like, the way in which iconic photographs could be iconic pictures and be known by a generation, I think that is really changing, right? Where we see a picture of a political event and people are like, will this be the iconic photo? And for a minute they think it will be, but then another one is posted and circulated. And so I do think, back to your question about, or somebody's question about, where do the pictures appear, that there is less of a shared visual vocabulary, right? And it's more community-based, but people who use TikTok could comment on that better than I can because I'm not on social media.
All right. Thank you. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I can't resist saying I'll be here on March 11th to give my version of the history too.
Okay, great.
Hi.
Hi.
I know you spoke earlier about, oh, can you hear me now? Oh,
yeah.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay. I know earlier you spoke about the importance of the women at Magnum and the structure that they took. I was wondering if you could speak more about the roles that they took on and when women started to come into Magnum as photographers.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Okay, so first, everywhere you look in every news and photo organization, the women are the ones pulling the pictures out of the drawers and putting them back in. They're organizing the files, which is incredibly important work. Your archive has no value if you don't know where the pictures are and how they're filed, and when you don't know when to find it. When an editor calls and says, we need, Matisse died, and if you don't know where your Matisse photos are, you've lost the sale. So the work of managing the picture files is really important. That is what women were doing at Magnum. They were doing that at Black Star. I'm sure they were doing that at AP, and all sorts of organizations. And so then they had other functions too. They were, as I said, in some cases, they were doing some sales agency work, but the more public-facing stuff in the 40s, 50s, that was actually still left to men. And I've read debates, could a woman really run the Paris office of Magnum? She ended up doing it, but after Robert Capa died, he was really the public face of the Paris office, and there were concerns that they needed to bring in a male editor, even one who didn't know the European market as well, but just because they needed a man to do those negotiations. In 1950, I want to say, so Inga Morath and Eve Arnold were the first female photographers to join Magnum. They joined in 53, 54. Inga Morath is represented in this story, in this exhibit. But as you can see, she's got a fashion portfolio, right? And so one of the ways that women had to get themselves known is by first photographing women type things. And there was I actually think Cornell Kappa, in a letter I read saying Eve Arnold is off doing her women things. And she was doing advertising campaigns for men in baby oil. She was doing maternity fashion. And so she started that way. And then when they became established through those kinds of markets, then they could transition into more mainstream, more general work. Yeah. I don't have the mic, so I don't, yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
This is kind of piggybacking off of one of the other questions, but I was wondering, would you say that the decline of curated archives in things like Getty and the oversaturation of images has created this sort of death of identifiable artist identity in photography?
Today?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's harder. I have, you know, I think in the 20s and the 30s, there was already a sense among photographers that there's a lot of us and we need to compete and we need to create some kind of identity. We need to have a visual style. We need to have a market that we specialize in. So again, I'm sorry to be like doing the same thing, but in some ways I do think it's harder, but in some ways I think that's what photographers have always had to do, is to kind of make themselves known. And one of the reasons that I really focus on the network in my research is because I do think connections really helped, you know, and a lot of the time, you know, I mentioned that some of these people are immigrants. They sometimes speak the same language. They come to America, but they speak German, they speak Hungarian. And so a lot of when you look back at where do people get published or you get their first opportunities, a lot of that has to do with who they knew, often when they were kind of making it in a new country. And so I don't think that networking is any less significant, but I'm sure it has a different tenor now, right? Like where you went to school, who was your professor, what internship opportunity. So it's morphed. But yeah, the quantity and the saturation makes everything much more challenging. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
We'll take maybe a couple additional questions if you have any. I saw a hand, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. A few weeks ago when Susan Meiselas was here, she briefly made reference to the Magnum book, America in Crisis. You know, it's my opinion that Magnum really was at its best when it was in the 1960s, commenting on the social turmoil. And whereas today, when I think of Magnum, I think of people like Bruce Gilden and Martin Parr. And it's not so much commentary. And I wonder if Magnum, in your opinion, has lost some of that empathy and humanism that you made reference to. Like, I don't want to put you in a bad spot where you burn any bridges, but I mean, it seems that commentary today is needed in such a big way, but
so I
don't know if it's the media not looking for that the way they did in the past, or if
so
it's
many
Magnum
things
changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's so many things. I do think that if you look at how Magnum is advertising itself on any given day, like if you go to its editorial page, it is often promoting the work of its photojournalists who are photographing wars and crises, humanitarian crises. There is that division of work that it does. There are fewer opportunities to get that work seen, to get it seen in long form, visual form, which is why photographers make photo books and why they try to make reports that they can control kind of in terms of from start to finish. But I think something that I'm arguing is that the humanism and the empathy always coexisted alongside the practical considerations, right? One of the things that Magnum said about itself is that we did start doing corporate work or more artsy work, but that was really the 70s and in the 80s, right? Because the other markets were declining. And I found that they were doing, like they were on film sets in the 40s, you know? And so, I think it's also a matter of discourse and visibility, right? That it was very hard to work on Magnum's advertising photography for me because those pictures are not credited. For as much as Magnum wants to control its copyright, when Elliott Erwitt or Cornell Kappa sells an advertising photo, their name is not on it. So unless you know that they took that picture, it's actually very hard to trace. It could be much more of like a covert, you know, it's not a, you know, process. So I'm not going to make a judgment about Magnum today. There are more photographers. They're doing new things. Martin Parr is part of a kind of a more artistic lineage of photography. And when I started my work on Magnum, I was very clear that I wasn't going to work on contemporary Magnum so that nobody thought that I was going to critique the contemporary institution. Same thing with ICP. My book on ICP is going to end in 1994 when Cornell Kappa retires. But you know, that same issue could be said of ICP. ICP was a museum that was started for concerned photography. American Crisis was, by the way, a project organized by Cornell Kappa when he was just in the beginning. He had just done the concerned photographer exhibit, and he got these Magnum photographers to do this exhibit and book on American Crisis. But so ICP was really supposed to become the place for engaged humanist photography where magazines were shrinking. By the 80s, and I interviewed Susan Meiselas because she and Cornell worked on a show in 1982, I want to say, of photographers from El Salvador who were photographing the Civil War. And I said, what was it like? And she said, well, what was on view? I remember going to ICP, so I have this spreadsheet, and I was like, well, it was Man Ray, and there was a Brodovich show, and there was celebrity, and she was like, it was a confusing place and a confusing time. So it very quickly sort of lost that mandate too, because I think as businesses, the places that want to be sustainable, you can't only do the empathy and the humanism, and you have to cater to multiple markets.
Thank you.
All right, one more question, maybe? Is there one more question?
Thank you all so much for your really engaged.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nadya. A quick note, the shows are open until December 13. Then they reopen after the winter break. And we have more public programs around Magnum and Chim planned. So please stay tuned and check the website. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up.